Wagmore wears a party hat on the dance floor. He says you better bark less if you want to love more. He says you better bark less if you want to love more. Bark less, Wagmore.
All right, bravo. That's great, Billy. I love that. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see everybody this morning. Well, I'm grateful that everybody braved the predicted storms this morning. You know, I was reminded that of all of the dire predictions for our weather this morning of something that Mark Twain once said. He said the rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. So I'm glad to see that we're all here and we haven't gotten washed away. I was really thinking about this week, kind of struggling a little bit with what I was going to talk about this week. It was kind of an interesting dynamic. I get into that every now and then from time to time. And wasn't sure what the title of my lesson was going to be, and I always like to try and get my title out to Laura so she can put it out to everybody. And it was finally Friday, and I usually really work on my lessons, you know, more intensely on Friday to kind of pull them together. And it came to me that I was really kind of getting in my own way with the title. And I for some reason, was looking at something, and it just occurred to me that I heard something that said, "Deliver me from ego." And so I really started reflecting on that and thinking about it and recognizing that I was letting my ego get in the way. I really, you know, sometimes we think that everything has to be absolutely perfect. And I can assure you that's the voice of the ego. And it's something worth recognizing. So I really began to listen to myself and what I was saying and what was going on within me about that. And I was thinking about ego and what it really means to be, you know, what the ego really is and what are we thinking about in terms of our ego. And I came across a cute story. It was a lady says a friend of mine was a teacher in school and had her hair, so she had straight hair, and she had it permed so that it was really curly, you know, and so she had a really curly style. And one morning she noticed that her 4-year-old Jack, who was usually cheerful, looked up and was kind of sad and bewildered, looked at her and she said, "Is there something wrong, Jack?" And he said, "Well, your hair." "Oh, you noticed? Oh, I just had it permed and I really love it." "You do? Have you seen it?" Well, I thought about that, and oftentimes we are so identified with how we look in life that we are really not really noticing who we truly are. It's not uncommon. One of the things that we do, and Louise Hay talks about this, is that one of the first things we do is we get up in the morning, we look in the mirror, and we don't necessarily look and see that amazing, beautiful light that we are. We see all the wrinkles, and we notice the hair, we notice all the appearances. And we want to notice that because that's one of the ways that we actually can help move ourselves past. We don't necessarily want to focus on all of those things. We want to begin to pay attention to really the essence of who we are. And the more we pay attention to the essence of who we are, we actually allow more of that essence to shine and to come through. Another great story I came across, it says it happened in the jungle one day. A lion with a big ego went around asking the other animals who the king of the jungle was. "Who's the king of the jungle?" the lion roared at a monkey. "Well, you are, Mr. Lion," said the monkey with fear in his voice. The lion went on and found a zebra. "Who's the king of the jungle?" he snarled. "Well, there's no doubt about it, sir. You're a lion. You're the king of the jungle." And then seeing a turtle crossing his path, the lion bellowed, "Who's the king of the jungle?" And scared out of his shell, the turtle basically trembled and said, "You are, Mr. Lion. You're the king of the jungle." And who's the king of the jungle? He saw an elephant coming along. A female elephant came along and he roared at this elephant and said, "Who's the king of the jungle?" And the elephant reached with his trunk and grabbed the lion by the tail and started slinging him around, slinging him up against a tree, dunked him in the water, threw him down on the ground. The lion just kind of stunned and said, "Well, just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean you have to get upset." But up. I resemble that remark, right? Well, and I really was looking at this whole thing, and I came across another great story, and this is a Zen story. And apparently, the prime minister of the Tang dynasty was a national hero for his success as both a statesman and a military leader. But despite his fame, power, and wealth, he considered himself a humble and devout Buddhist. Often he visited his favorite Zen master to study under him, and they seemed to get along really well. And the fact that he was the prime minister apparently had no effect on their relationship. They just seemed to be there as equals, and would seem to really be simply one of the Reverend's respectful students to the. And so one day during a visit, the prime minister asked the master, "Your Reverence, what is egotism according to Buddhism?" The master's face turned really red, and he looked at him, and he was considering, and in a very insulting tone, he said, "What kind of stupid question is that?" An unexpected response from him. The prime minister was so shocked, he became very sullen and very angry, and then the Zen master just smiled and said, "That's egotism." Wow. To me, that's a powerful story, because I really think it really does point out in many ways how we can really understand and know whether we are in our ego heart and mind, or whether we're coming from a place of our divine nature, our true spiritual nature. Eckhart Tolle says the word "I" embodies the greatest error and the deepest truth, depending on how it is used. In conventional usage, it is not only one of the most frequently used words in the language, together with the related words me, my, mine, and myself, but also one of the most misleading. In normal everyday usage, "I" embodies the primordial error, a misperception of who you are, an illusory sense of identity. This is the ego. This illusory sense of self is what Albert Einstein, who had deep insight not only into the reality of space and time, but also into human nature, referred to as an optical illusion of consciousness. That illusory self then becomes the basis for all further interpretations, or rather misinterpretations of reality. All thought processes, interactions, and relationships. Your reality becomes a reflection of the original illusion. So what is this original illusion that he is referring to? And he's talking about the use of the word "I." And he really talks about and teaches this idea, this understanding that what we identify with, what we say is our "I," is an illusion. In other words, the ego is a concept that we have of who we are. It is a belief system of who we are. This conception of who we are, we become so identified with this idea, this belief system of who we are, that we actually forget who we are. That make sense? And it's so easy to do. And he calls it going unconscious. We tend to go unconscious of who we are. And the very act of identifying ourselves with an idea or a belief system that we've created of who we are is the very thing that actually keeps us unconscious. And so there's a mechanism within ourselves where we are identifying with the form, identifying with things in the world, identifying with something that is out here and what Jesus referred to as the world, rather than recognizing the kingdom within. that Jesus referred to. And the kingdom within is really that inner awareness of our true divine nature, of who we were created in the image and after the likeness of Spirit, of the divine. So we're created as creative beings, and we're created in that image and likeness, and we are continually in the process of creating, but we're creating in ways oftentimes that are somewhat illusory. And one of the things that the story kind of reminds me of, the story of the Zen stories, is an understanding that when we are in a place of ego, we can usually tell when we're in a place of ego if we are willing to just simply begin to wake up just a little bit. It's easy to figure it out, you know. There are different little signs that help us know whether we're in the place of ego or not. One of the first signs is if we have a complaint. Anybody ever had a complaint? You can pretty much bet that if you've got a complaint, it's not your spiritual nature that's doing it. Think about that for a moment. Just kind of reflect on that. Spirit doesn't complain. Our essence doesn't complain. Our spirit simply creates. It simply shapes. It simply forms. So resentment is another one. Resentment, is, Eckhart Tolle says, is the emotion that goes with complaining and the mental labeling of people and adds even more energy to the ego. Resentment means to feel bitter, indignant, aggravated, or offended. To resent other people's greed, their dishonesty, their lack of integrity, what they are doing and what they did in the past, what they said, what they failed to do, what they should or shouldn't have done. See, the ego loves it. Instead of overlooking unconsciousness in others, you make it into their identity. Who is doing that? The unconsciousness in you, the ego. Sometimes the fault that you perceive in another isn't even there. It is totally a misinterpretation, a projection by a mind conditioned to see enemies to make itself right or superior. At other times, the fault may be theirs, but by focusing on it, sometimes to the exclusion of everything else, you amplify it. And what you react to in another, you strengthen in yourself. Let me say that phrase again because that's so powerful in understanding. What you react to in another, you strengthen in yourself. Well, I started thinking and reflecting on that and realized that I've been watching way too much news lately. Watching too much politics. Anybody notice? And one of the things that I find is that when it's so easy to get caught up in the drama of all of it. And don't get me wrong, it's important. I'm not going to suggest it's not important. But I think it's important for us in terms of an awakening of our own energy and awareness that we are participating in it with. Does that make sense? So how are we participating in all of this process? How are we participating in all of the things that go on in this election process or the world experiences or the things that are happening in the world? A big part of our awakening is to really begin to notice and pay attention to not so much what's going on out there, but what's going on in here in reaction to what's going on out there, in reaction to it. In Christian healing, Charles Fillmore says, the personal self is the ego around which revolves all thoughts that bind us to error. And he goes on in Keep It True Land, he says, the ego is itself ego of itself is possessed of nothing. It is a mere ignorant child of innocence floating in the mind of being. But through the door of its consciousness must be passed all the treasures of God. In other words, what he's saying here is that the I that we recognize and identify with, all of our experiences actually come through that sense of I. And so it's so important for us to pay attention and notice where we have placed that sense of I. Have we placed it on things that are going on out here in the world that are changing, that are constantly moving and shifting? Are we absolutely involved in and caught up in believing that who we are has something to do with what's going on out here. It has to do with something with our job, has to do with something with our spouse, with our children, has to do with something with our elected officials or the ones that want to be elected officials. It has nothing to do with that. We get caught up in all the drama of these things, and when we're doing that, what we're doing is placing a sense of our well-being, our sense of who we are, outside of our true nature and true being. Charles Fillmore goes on to say in Christian Healing, the I that dies daily is personal consciousness, formed of fear, ignorance, disease, the lust of material possessions, pride, anger, and the legion of demons that cluster about the personal ego. The only Savior, in quotes, is the one is Christ within the spiritual ego, the superconsciousness. So what he's talking about here is the difference between, in one sense, there are two I's in a very real sense. There's an I that identifies with things out here in the world, and there's the I am, that is our divine nature. And if we're identifying with the I that says that, I am this physical being or I am out here in the world, we're missing out on really connecting with that essence of who and what we are. And so there's a self-identity practice that we want to participate in of recognizing when we're doing that. Now, we all do it. I do it. It's part of what brought this lesson about. I was doing it. I was in the middle of really identifying with things out here. I noticed it was really intense when I was doing my taxes, and so I'm having to really do a lot of noticing that, I have taxes, but I'm not my taxes, right? So part of the spiritual ego or spiritual man, Charles Fillmore says, has its first development on the physical plane, and the two egos, the spiritual and the physical, are united there in appropriating physical things, personal things, that they consider valuable, such as appetites, passions, and other things on the same plane. The spiritual man advances or develops beyond that. He does not want these things, so he gives them all to the personality, the physical ego. So one of the things we talk about in Unity, one of the things that Charles Fillmore talked about is that you and I have a personality, which could be related to the ego. We also have our individuality. And our individuality is really that unique expression of the I am that each and every one of us has and is within our own nature. And so part of our spiritual practice is to begin to really identify, not so much with our personality, but with our individuality. You'll find that all of the difficulties and challenges that we're experiencing and have in our world and our life today are a result of people believing that they are their egos. Their physical egos, their personality. And the conflicts that we have are not conflicts between our individuality. Our individuality doesn't really have conflicts with other people's individuality. We recognize and honor the individuality. We find the beauty in it. We find the significance and the wonder of another person's individual expression of the light. When you're in that place where you are connected with your own unique individuality, you don't have a problem with people being different. You don't have a problem with people expressing in a different way. And you don't really even have a problem with other people's personalities, for that matter, because you recognize that's a personality. That's how they are. It's one of the ways that they are expressing in life. But when we think that we are our personality gets threatened by other people's personalities. We get bothered by, we get our, as we say, our buttons pushed. Our buttons are not in our individuality, they're in our belief system about who we are. And we have to defend who we think we are. And one of the ways that people have a tendency to want to defend who they think they are is to get other people to be like them. If you are like me, then I like you. But if you're not like me, you have a different point of view, you see things differently, you experience things from a different perception, a different awareness, a different understanding, well, you're obviously wrong. right? Wrong, right? So there's some ways that we deal with life. Sue Sicking says there's a difference between ego, which is the whole man, and egotism, which is focusing on the outer man and separating this outer man from completeness. When we're in our experience of completeness, we don't feel threatened by other people's differences. We don't feel threatened by other people expressing and being how they are. There's much more of awareness of allowing the world to be as it is. The reality is we keep trying to change the world to fit into our belief system of how it's supposed to be, don't we? We can pretty much bet when we're doing that, we're coming from our ego consciousness. But when we're really allowing things to unfold and knowing that there's something more at work than our own understanding and vision of what's going on, then it's easier to let go of how we think things are supposed to be so that we can really explore and discover. I think one of the most valuable ways that we can truly tap back into our essence and our true nature is to begin to really develop a sense of curiosity. Curiosity, a willingness to learn, a willingness to discover, a willingness to explore and expand our understanding, to see things not only from our own perception, but to be willing to put ourselves into the shoes of another and see from the other's point of view. We don't necessarily have to agree with the other's point of view, but if we open ourselves up to see the other person's point of view, we can see where they're coming from. It creates more of an experience of inclusiveness as opposed to exclusiveness. So, as I was reflecting on this, I came across some ideas and some awarenesses from my meditations and from Eckhart Tolle and from Jesus and from Michael Singer, who wrote this wonderful work called The Untethered Soul. Many of you are familiar with that. Just a beautiful, beautiful spiritual teaching. So here's some steps that came to me about ways that I, myself, could really begin to become not free of the ego. I have an idea that one of the things we do is we try to eliminate the ego, and the ego loves that game. Ego really loves when you try to get rid of ego. Because I can assure you it's the ego that's trying to get rid of the ego. Does that make sense? And we get caught up in this thing of not being and not having an ego. And that's probably one of the most egotistical things we can do. See, we're in this world, and the ego has its place and its purpose. But the idea is not to necessarily try to get rid of the ego. What happens when we try to get rid of the ego is we actually repress a lot of our thoughts, feelings, belief systems, ideas, and the very act of repressing those makes them unconscious to us. And we go unconscious, and that creates what Eckhart Tolle calls pain body. When we're going unconscious to our own experiences and awareness, we're creating even more experiences of the pain body. And the pain body is really what acts out so much of our difficulties and challenges in life. And the way it acts it out is we push it down, and it's kind of like pushing down a beach ball under the water and trying to sit on it and balance, you know? It's a great image. I really love that image because that's what we have a tendency to do. We have a tendency to try to hide from that ego consciousness. And in the very act of doing that, it keeps us off balance all the time. And eventually that beach ball is going to pop out somewhere, and it usually pops out, as you've heard me say before, it pops out on the faces of those around us. It pops out on our boss, our spouse, our coworkers, our candidates, or the opposing candidate oftentimes, you know. And so part of the idea is not to try and get rid of the ego, but to become aware of it and to become awake to it. Because the more we can become aware of it and become awake to it, we actually begin to transcend it. And we are actually disallowing a lot of the energy and the power that we're giving to it. We're becoming more aware. I really think that that's one of the main things that we're here to do. In his book, a new earth, Eckhart Tolle says that that's really our primary purpose, is to wake up. And the way that we wake up is to wake up. It's not only our purpose, it's our process. And so the process of moving and living our purpose is our purpose and our process. So we're here to try and be more aware and conscious and awake to ourselves and to what's going on and to our process and to what's happening in us and how we are participating and forming and shaping, creating things out here in the world, but we are not the things that we're shaping and forming. We're at the essence of creation. We are participating in the creative process, and we are coming from a place of understanding and awareness that allows us to do that in a way that really does allow that creative process to be natural and to flow more. So here's some steps that came to me in some of the readings I've been doing recently. Steps to transcend the ego. Notice and observe the voice in the head. You guys know the voice? It's the crazy roommate, as Michael Singer calls it. Crazy roommate. We all got a crazy roommate. And that crazy roommate oftentimes is running the show, is telling us what to do and how to do and what not to do and how not to do, telling us who we are and who we're not, and who we can be and who we can't be. And it's ongoing, isn't it? And the more we try to hush up the crazy roommate, sometimes we can get it to be a little quieter, but then it comes up really loud at different times. And sometimes we're the crazy roommate. We identify ourselves with those voices. We think that is our voice, you know? So one of the most important and valuable things we can do is observe and notice the voice. The voice that goes on inside of us that has all kinds of things to say, and you know, none of them are really very, very appealing. You can pretty much bet if it is a voice that is complaining, criticizing, judging, fearful, resentful, any of the catabolic energies that you've heard me talk about. Catabolic means life depleting. You can pretty much bet it's the voice of the ego. But if you are really tuning into your essence and to that consciousness within, you will notice that the energies are life enhancing. They're anabolic, they're uplifting, they're positive, they're healing, they're transformative. And it begins to shift our awareness by simply noticing and paying attention to the energies and the feelings that we're participating in. Another step is notice reactivity and grievances. Notice when you're reacting to something. Anybody ever react to something? See, there's a difference between reacting and responding, right? It's so valuable for us to really notice how we're reacting to something. If you catch yourself reacting to something, recognize that that's not coming from your awareness, it's coming from your unawareness, right? It's coming from that place within you where you're unconscious. And it's coming from a place from something from the past has been triggered. A belief system and experience has been triggered. And you brought that experience and the energy of that into the present moment. Make sense? Eckhart Tolle says, non-reaction to the ego and others is one of the most effective ways only of going beyond ego in yourself, but also, he says, not only of going beyond ego within yourself, but also of dissolving the collective human ego. But you can only be in a state of non-reaction if you can recognize someone's behavior as coming from the ego, as being an expression of the collective human dysfunction. When you realize it's not personal, there's no longer a compulsion to react as if it were. So if you're taking something personally, it's your personality. Right? If someone says something and it pushes the buttons You got the buttons, right? And so when we are paying attention to these things, we notice them, we can begin to recognize, and we, in a very real sense, what we're doing is distancing ourselves from it. So notice, observe when we are in a place where we're complaining. Because the very act of complaining in itself is not only an act of the ego, it is something that actually strengthens the ego. It actually creates even more of that sense of, interestingly enough, it creates more of a sense of who we are. An illusion of who we are, let's say. Oftentimes, our complaints, we become very identified with our complaints. We think that because we have a complaint, then somehow that gives us a sense of who we are. Does that make sense? Eckhart Tolle says, notice and observe the need to be right and to make wrong. When you notice within yourself this need to be right, interestingly enough, one of the ways that we try to fulfill that need to be right is to make somebody else wrong. We do that just almost like, knee-jerk reaction kind of thing. Notice and observe the need to compare. Compare yourself with others. Need to feel either superior or inferior. And then notice and observe how and what you are identifying yourself with, how you are seeing yourself. And if you're seeing yourself in a way that is less than, or for that matter, if you're seeing yourself in some way where you feel like you need to, where you are somehow more than, then you probably are coming from your ego consciousness. I was thinking as I was listening to this and kind of talking about it is, Jeff Foxworthy, who says, he has this great routine about, you're probably a redneck. You know that one? Some of you ever heard that one? You're probably in your ego is one of the things that comes to me. If you are identifying yourself in a way that is somehow less than or more than. And then the other thing to really notice and pay attention to, we have a tendency to see and experience ourselves, our life, and the world as a movie in our heads. And we think that we are the star of the movie. And we think we're actually in the movie. And when we're in the movie, we're no longer watching the movie. We're no longer, even for that matter, the director of the movie. We're just caught up in the movie. We're caught up in these images and these beliefs and these ideas and these experiences, and we're seeing a movie. And so one of the ways that we can really pay attention to notice whether we are coming from our ego consciousness or coming from our divine individualized nature is to step back and make sure that we are simply noticing the movie, observing the movie, recognizing the movie. The other one, the movie is basically also our story. Sometimes we're seeing the movie, sometimes we're simply telling our story. You know the story? We all have our story, right? We're telling our story, and sometimes even if nobody else is listening, we're still telling our stories to ourselves over and over again. And the story usually has a similar plot. I think we all have a very similar plot in our story in our movie, and that is, it's the somebody done somebody wrong song. You know that one? And it's usually us, or for that matter, sometimes we see ourselves as the villain. Occasionally that does pop up as well. So Eckhart Tolle says a very common role is the one of victim, and the form of attention it seeks is sympathy or pity or others' interest in my problems, me and my story. Seeing oneself as a victim is an element in many egoic patterns such as complaining, being offended, outrage, and so on. Well, wait a minute. He says, of course, once I am identified with the story in which I assign myself the role of victim, I don't want to end it. And so, as every therapist knows, the ego does not want an end to its problems. And because they are part of its identity. If no one will listen to my sad story, I can tell it to myself in my head over and over and feel sorry for myself. And so have an identity as someone who is being treated unfairly by life or other people, fate or God. It gives definition to my self-image, makes me into someone, and that is all that matters to the ego. It gives us a sense of self-identity. Whether we like it or not, whether we think it's right or not, we oftentimes don't think it's right, and yet we're very involved in it, very committed to it. We're committed to our story, oftentimes. And so one of the steps to move back from this story is to be an observer. Begin to observe and to breathe into the heart is an excellent way of moving back into an essence, an experience of who you are. You know, we can breathe into that heart space. It brings us back more into the present moment. Move back into the present moment and recognize and acknowledge that there's a story, but you're not necessarily in the story. You don't have to be in the story. In fact, you can ask the question, and here's some questions to ask yourself. When you find yourself getting caught up in this role, ask yourself this question: who is thinking this thought? Who's feeling these feelings? Who's experiencing this experience? Who's watching this movie? Who's telling this story? And then listen for that little voice inside that says, me, I am. Ignore the me. Listen to the I am. Let yourself move back into that awareness of I am. And recognize that I have thoughts, I have feelings, I have experiences, I have a story, I have a movie playing in my head, and I'm not the movie. And I'm not the actors in the movie, and I'm not the star of the movie. Begin to identify with the I am. The more we identify with that essence of who and what we are, the less we get run by and controlled by and triggered by and moving into the reactions of the ego, heart, and mind. So those are my lessons for this week, and I invite you to take some time to play with them and just begin to notice what's going on for you as you begin to go through your week. Where are you coming from, and what is the energy, and where are you experiencing yourself? Are you experiencing your little self as that identified with shape, form, stuff that's going on out here, or are you identified with the essence of who you are? And when you come from this place, there's an energy, a power, and a strength of awareness and understanding that allows you not to respond or react to other people's experiences, because it's a recognition that they're simply playing out their own little role, and you don't have to necessarily play the role with them. Not always easy to do, though. I recognize that. But it is probably one of the most valuable and important things we can do for ourselves to really truly experience the joy that we affirmed this morning. So have fun with that this week. Let's have some music and then move into our meditation time. So let's move into that stillness, that silence, that quiet place within our own nature, breathing in and out, relaxing the physical body, And as you breathe in and out, I invite you to begin to notice the breath and breathing into the heart space. Let an awareness come into your being of that voice of the I am, not the one that is always chattering, but the one that is more still. Become aware of the physical body and recognize that, and even affirm for yourself, I have a body, but I am not my body. I have a body, but I am not my body. The body is a way that we can express, but it's not the essence of who and what we are. It's just one of the ways that we express our divine nature. I have a body, but I am not my body. If you notice sensations in the body, just be aware of those sensations and notice and observe and acknowledge that I have sensations, but I'm not these sensations. Perhaps you have a discomfort or a pain even for that matter, and just notice it, observe it, acknowledge it. I have a discomfort or a pain, but I'm not this discomfort or pain. And just simply observe it. Be aware. If emotions come up for you, just notice the emotions, the feelings, and just acknowledge them. And affirm for yourself, I have emotions, feelings, but I'm not my emotions. And if a sense of who you are comes up, notice it. And just ask the question, who am I? And listen for that still small voice inside. Usually it'll say something like me. And then ask again, well, who am I? Who's me? And listen deep in your heart to that voice of I am. And feel yourself immersed in that sense of I am that is beyond all of the outer experiences and expressions, roles, illusions. Feel yourself completely immersed in that awareness, that consciousness that is beyond all these conceptions, ideas, limiting beliefs, and know that that inner voice, that inner essence of I am, is your unique individual connection with Spirit. Give thanks and celebrate that feeling, that knowing, that essence, that consciousness that sees and knows you as you are. The I am. Take a nice deep breath into that heart space and give thanks for that essence, that feeling, that freedom that comes from truly aligning with that divine nature. And as you breathe into that heart space, let your awareness come back into this room, this time and place, but stay in that consciousness and that awareness of I am. Practice seeing through the eyes of that awareness, looking at yourself and your world. Take another nice deep breath. Let your awareness be in this room, this time and place. Let your eyes gently come open. Be open to seeing through those eyes of spirit, of I am. Take another nice deep breath. Be present here and now. And give thanks. And so it is.